Hello class, and welcome to your first take-home video lecture of the year. These lectures will always be posted on my website and will remain posted on my website throughout the year. So if you want to review or revisit any of these lectures, feel free to pull up my website and to take a look. These are great opportunities to review some information, be able to pause and listen to them at your own pace and take notes at your own pace. I may have said so in class already, but the purpose of these lectures is to get some information to you quickly. The goal is to expand the walls of the classroom so that we can have some lectures that deliver information relatively rotely to you effectively. We don't have to waste class time doing this. In that sense, we're able to then use our class time much more effectively to do stuff, which is actually exactly the purpose and the point of this first lecture. The lecture that we're going to be talking about today, or the topic that we'll be talking about, is known as inquiry. Okay, inquiry is a method of teaching, a method of learning that can be used and often is used in many classes, but it's particularly useful in a science class. What I want to do in this lecture is to introduce you to what inquiry is, how we will be implementing inquiry, and what it means for you. So let's take a look and let's start defining what this means, and let's move on to the next slide. All right, the inquiry process is a process of learning, is a process of teaching that utilizes what inquiry means, which is to say questioning. The whole process of learning, any process of good, effective learning, requires questioning on this part of the student, on the part of the teacher as well. At all points in the learning process, you should be asking questions. You should be trying to develop ways to answer those questions, collect information, collect data to help you answer questions, and to then reflect on the answers or the data that you did generate. And you'll see that this chart here gives us a good look into what kinds of questions, only some of the kinds of questions, that you might want to be asking yourself as you're learning, if we're doing so in an inquiry-based way. So for example, if we are posing questions, you might ask yourself as or while you're posing questions, maybe even before you're posing questions, what do I already know about the thing that I want to ask questions about? How do I know what I know? Where did I find that information? What other information might I need to make my answers more effective or more legitimate or valid? Potentially, what even could an answer be? Part of asking questions is having a good idea of what the answer already is. You're going to be finding resources to help you answer questions. You'll be developing processes and paths to help you get to answers. So you might need resources. You might have to look for resources yourself independently, and you might have to know where to look, what information is valid, who is responsible for this information, and so on and so forth. After you find resources, you'll be interpreting information and reporting findings. You may or may not be aware that you're doing this already, but any kind of good, effective learning follows these steps. To use some academic language to describe inquiry-based learning, we might describe inquiry learning as an inductive way of learning. What that might mean is that from examples, so for example, if we're looking at a lab report or some kind of laboratory investigation, you might generate data from a particular or singular lab. You might get data. And from that data, even though it's one instance of data, we can then extrapolate that data and say, maybe this data represents something larger, some larger concept. For example, if we're looking at plants or a single plant, we can understand the data there to tell us lots about maybe photosynthesis in general. So this one plant might represent all types of plants in some regards. So it is an inductive way of learning. It is a very student-centered way of learning where the student does a lot of the work, a lot of the thinking, as opposed to me as a teacher giving you information. That's what really inquiry is all about. It's about students constructing their knowledge instead of teachers delivering it to them, for them. Inquiry, then, is a really great way to learn in a science class, because then if we compare, for example, the process of inquiry, as we can see over here in this sort of diagram here, and what we know as the scientific method on the right, we can see that the inquiry or an inquiry-based learning process requires us to ask questions, investigate, create explanations, discuss or conclude about those explanations, reflect on how valid or worthwhile they are, and maybe ask new questions and go on from there. The scientific method is in many ways the same. So the inquiry process lends itself very well to be a learning process that we use in a science class. It actually lends itself so well that most of the learning that we want to do here in AP Biology will be in some ways inquiry-based. However, it's really important to know that not all inquiry is equal. There have been academic thinkers that have described 4 different levels of inquiry learning. And we're going to quickly talk about those levels because it's important for us to be aware of what we're doing and what that necessarily means for our learning. Okay, so there are 4 different levels of inquiry. We're going to call them, number 1, confirmational, 2, structured inquiry, 3, guided inquiry, and 4, open inquiry. And the way we can differentiate or describe these levels of inquiry is on how involved the teacher or the student are in being able to navigate their way through an investigation, a lab, for example. So if we look at 3 elements of the lab, we look at who's providing the question, who's providing the procedure to address or to answer the question, and who's drawing conclusions regarding that question or the answer to that question. We can then describe those 4 different levels of inquiry. So for example, a confirmational inquiry lab would be a lab where I, as a teacher, give you the question that you'll be answering. I, as a teacher, give you the procedure that you'll be following. I, as a teacher, also, probably before the lab, give you the conclusions that you should expect, so that all you have to do is confirm what I've given you. In many ways, we just call these recipe labs or cookbook labs. They're not very high level. They're not very inquiry based. They don't require almost anything of the student except to follow directions. There's really no learning going on. There's no science skills being developed in a confirmational lab. It might be good to see those things happening in real life, but that's not real science, and we're not trying to develop those kinds of skills. The next level up, we might see a structured inquiry lab, where I, as a teacher, give you the question, and maybe I also give you the procedure to try to answer that question, but you don't have the conclusions already. The job of you, as a student, is to perform the lab in order to draw conclusions. This is a very structured way of learning, whereas I structure your environment so that you're going to find successful results and successful conclusions. But you are doing something. You are drawing conclusions, and it is a practice of some science skills. Now, it's not the best kind of inquiry because I'm still doing most of the work for you, but you're doing something. We can move forward into a guided inquiry where I give you a question to answer. Maybe I give you materials to use, but I don't give you the procedure on how to answer that question. You have to develop that procedure yourself as a student, all right? And maybe one group might come up with a different procedure than another group, and maybe both of those procedures are valid. Maybe one is more valid than the next, but as we draw conclusions, as students, we will be able to evaluate which procedures were more effective and which ones weren't. Maybe and answer those questions as to why that might be. As an AP class, this is where we really need to get. We might not be ready yet for guided inquiry yet. But by the end of the year, we will be engaging in guided inquiry, where I will be giving you a question and I tell you, given these materials, go answer this question in any way that you see fit. Because ultimately, questions are given to us. We are required to come up with answers. We are required to come up with ways to get to those answers. And the fourth and truest level of inquiry is what we're going to call open inquiry, where ultimately you are on your own. You are your own scientist. In an open inquiry, you generate questions. You generate procedures. You generate conclusions. You are doing science as purely as you can. Now, we will do open inquiry, or we will start to touch on open inquiry, where you might, after a particular investigation, come up with a new question to test after we've performed maybe a structured inquiry. All right, so we'll be talking more about these in just a second. But these are the 4 levels of inquiry. We can say that conformational and structured inquiry is all about pre-AP classes. All right, those are your freshman, sophomore, and junior level classes. And in an AP class, we're looking to approach guided inquiry and hopefully even open inquiry. So let's quickly and maybe briefly try to apply these words to maybe one kind of scientific investigation that we might be performing this year. Let's look at this plant, for example, and let's try to understand, or let's try to predict that we would be performing a lab on photosynthesis. Okay, I'm not going to finish the word. With photosynthesis, you might already have some information, and there's a likelihood that I'm going to be providing you with information. For example, the chemical equation for photosynthesis that tells us the reactions and what the plant produces in photosynthesis. In a conformational lab, I might give you all of that information, and then I might tell you, all right, let's verify that the plant produces oxygen as a result. Let's verify that. Okay, and we could then test that. You already know this is the conclusion we should draw. You should know that we would be looking for oxygen. And I would give you a procedure to answer that question so that everybody would get to, oh, the plant produces oxygen. You already know the conclusion before you even begin. This is a recipe. It's a cookbook lab. Not much, we're probably not going to engage in much of that in this class. However, another kind of structured inquiry might be, I tell you, we know what plants use in photosynthesis. They use sunlight, and they use CO2 and water. Okay. Let's try to develop, or I would give you a procedure to prove or demonstrate that plants produce certain products. And we might come up with ways to test for oxygen, ways to test for CO2, ways to test for other gases or other products, and ultimately the conclusion you would come to, even if I didn't tell you that conclusion, is plants produce oxygen as a waste product. Okay. In a guided inquiry, I might say, use these instruments, use these tools to develop a procedure to test how to determine what plants produce as waste products. All right, I might give you all different kinds of digital sensors to test different products. I might give you thermometers. I might give you rulers. I might give you all sorts of tools to measure, and you would have to come up with a way to measure in some way what kind of products plants produce as waste products. And then the last level, as an open inquiry, I might ask you, go, learn something about a plant. Ask a question, develop a procedure, come up with results, come up with data, and draw conclusions from that data. All right? We might do that after a structured inquiry lab. Okay, we might do that afterwards using a similar kind of procedure, but we would change that procedure just a little bit. Okay, so that's just a broad rundown of inquiry, some examples or applications of those levels of inquiry, just so that you as students are aware that we will be engaging in different kinds of inquiry-based learning procedures. Looking at inquiry a slightly different way now, we can then conclude that guided inquiry and open or free inquiry, these kinds of inquiry, as we can see, have much more or require much more student initiative. It requires more learning, more thinking on your end, and less work in some ways, or less direct, immediate work on my part as a teacher. What this means is you probably are constructing more knowledge. You are learning more through an inquiry-based learning process than a low student initiative kind of learning. You can take a look at these 4 different kinds of descriptions of learning. And anything goes, or a laissez-faire kind of learning, there is low student control and low student initiative. That means that class is doing whatever it wants because the teacher doesn't have a plan. Hey, that's not what we're doing in our class, I promise you that. We will always have a plan. It's never going to be an anything goes type of classroom. There are going to be times where we have some structured learning going on, structured inquiry, where there's high student control and to some extent low student initiative. For example, this video lecture. All right, it requires relatively little of you, and I'm delivering most of the content to you. I'm sort of filling you up with knowledge. We're going to do that a little bit because there's lots of stuff to cover, but we're not going to do it a whole lot. We are going to push ourselves to move towards guided inquiry that, again, requires more of you as students to do more work and learning in and out of class. And as a result, we will find much more positive, much more effective results. And so that's where we're headed. What that means now is that concludes this first video lecture. Thanks for listening, and you'll have further directions after the video. Thanks, guys.